Alright, so instructional technique wise, not much to tell you here. It's a very much abbreviated version of the takeoff briefing because there's no need to go into the same level of detail as you did previously. You'll see there's a table that comes up which summarises things, and you may just have to expand on the odd thing that is different for landing. Again, do a P chart. Do a P chart at the end of this one. Don't forget to do that. What else can I tell you? In the case of Massey, we don't obviously do this briefing at the same time as the short field takeoff one, so you may find there's been several months, if not a whole semester, between delivering short field takeoff and this briefing, and so it may be necessary for you to actually expand on all the reasons or all the factors in a lot more detail. If you are delivering them on the same day though, like today, there's no need obviously to do that. And remember, in the industry, normally both briefings are delivered at the same time. So this one should be somewhat simpler. So resources wise, P charts, probably the flight manual would be good. And you don't necessarily have to bring up AC 913 or group rating numbers again, because there's a lot of crossover in this briefing with the previous one. But short field landing, so what goes up must come down again, and we're looking at a different kind of landing today. It's not a landing where there's insufficient distance to stop. It's not a landing that we haven't calculated that the distance is safe. It's not a landing that has a surface that is not suitable to land on. We'll deal with all of those things in a separate briefing, even though it does relate to this briefing. It is a landing where the landing distance available is similar to the landing distance required. There isn't the same margin as what we've been used to. Landing on a seal runway, we generally only need approximately 500-600 meters, and we've got 2,000. So now we're talking about landing on the grass runway, where the landing distance required, the landing distance available are much more similar. This briefing with the P chart will probably take us about 35 minutes. Here's our objectives, have a read. So you'll notice similarities. Again, we're going to be calculating the distance. We're going to be assessing all of the factors, developing our awareness, making a decision, and we're going to be using the manufacturer's techniques to carry out a short field landing. So thinking back to short field takeoff, what was different about a short field takeoff versus a normal takeoff? Now they can probably give you some of these answers, but what you're summarising here is really that we were interested in maximising the takeoff distance available, and we wanted to minimise the takeoff distance required. There was a big emphasis on awareness and decision making, and that's true for today's part of the lesson as well. All the same considerations. Once again, I've been taking care of the landing performance for you up to this point, but from today onwards, once I've shown you how to do the P chart, I'm going to hand that responsibility over to you. So the onus will be on you to do these calculations, if and when required, and report to me in the pre-flight briefing around your decision as to whether or not we can take off and land on this particular runway today. So far in your training, we've looked at normal landings and we've looked at flapless landings, and today is really the only other type of landing that there is, a short field landing. It's a slightly adapted landing approach and landing technique. We were very much interested in a stable approach, awareness of the factors that affect the landing distance, and ensuring that we actually touch down at a sensible place on the runway. But if not, then having the discipline to go around and have another go, or divert to another aerodrome if it's not safe to land here. So that stuff's important, okay? So why might we need to do this? I've already indicated where the landing distance available is similar to the landing distance required. And that could be because of a number of reasons. Maybe it is a short runway like the grass runway. Maybe it's a longer runway but it has long grass. Or maybe there are obstacles at the landing end of the runway, meaning that we've got to touch down further into the runway. An example of that could be, you could talk about a Potiki aerodrome, or even Turangi actually, but a Potiki is not quite a nice one because at both ends the displaced threshold's like 250 metres or more displaced. I can't remember why, I think it's terrain or trees at either end, so the whole runway is actually quite long, but by the time you account for those thresholds, it's quite a short runway, so it's probably somewhere where you have to do a short field landing. It's also a procedure that we might use for an emergency landing, what we call a precautionary landing, which we'll deal with a bit later on when we discuss low flying. Now thinking back to the short field takeoff, so you'd ask again, how do we determine that a runway is safe for us to take off on? Because it's the same things here, right? So add detail if you need to, if it's been some time since you did the takeoff, excuse me, the takeoff mass brief. I'm just going to skip through this because we're just expanding on all of this, but bring up AC 91.3 if you need to, and then you come up to the table here. So now that we've discussed the different ways of determining that a runway is safe for us to land on, let's talk about some of those factors again, and we'll discuss all the same factors as for the takeoff mass brief. Pressure, altitude, density, altitude. So pressure and density, they all have the same effect on the landing distance. A high pressure altitude, a high density altitude, both increase the landing distance required. And this is because as the density reduces, the TAS of the aeroplane has to increase. So we're actually landing at a higher true speed, which means the aeroplane has more momentum and will take longer to stop. So we have to be very cautious on days where it is really hot, such as in the middle of summer. Trying to land on a grass runway on a day where it's 28 or 30 degrees might not work. An increase in weight also increases the landing distance required for two reasons. One, as we discussed in the takeoff briefing, it increases the inertia of the aeroplane. So it takes longer to slow down. And secondly, there is increased momentum, which also means the aeroplane will take longer to slow down. So ideally we are as light as possible for the shortest possible landing distance. Runway surface, we talked about this in detail in the previous briefing, but whether that surface is grass or seal or some other type, and whether that surface is dry or wet. Grass and wet is the worst combination. Why do you think that is? So you could ask them that question, see if they know, or ask them about have they ever driven their car on grass and tried to stop quickly or slide. There's not enough friction for the tyres to grip. Wet runway, you might sink into the mud, braking actions again reduce, so there's not enough friction for the tyres to grip. Slope, ask them about that. Again, you can relate it back to being in the car or a bike if they don't drive. The science behind it, which you don't need to go into, is the impact of the components of weight. Remember that, but it's not necessary to go through that. Wind, okay, you can use again your extremes from the previous briefing if you want to. I don't need to present that to you. But momentum's a big thing here, right? With a tailwind, your momentum is going to be a lot higher, longer distance to stop. With the weight one, you could also ask them about have they ever towed a trailer before in their car or truck or whatever and needed to stop quickly. It's a much longer distance, so everyday examples like that could be good. Flat landing, they should know about that, so ask some questions around that. Lots of drag allows us to land at slower speeds, reduced momentum, reduced landing roll, lower stall speed. So the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 factors are things that we can actually quantify on our performance graphs. The rest of the factors are things that we should think about and consider, but we can't quantify them in numbers, but they're nevertheless still really important, and there's probably even more than are written on there as well. So the state that the aircraft itself is in, any wear and tear, do the wings still have the same ability to produce lift as they did when it was put onto line from the manufacturer? What about the engine? What's the condition of the engine? Unless the engine is brand new, it is not going to perform as well as it did when it was originally built. And the propeller. Is the propeller working as well as it used to? Can it still produce the same amount of thrust? Maybe not. So all of these things should be thought about. The age of the aeroplane. And another really important thing is your ability. So today is the first time where you'll actually have a go at landing the aeroplane with a reduced landing distance available. You're not going to be perfect at it. You're going to need plenty of practice, and we'll give you plenty of practice, and you'll find your confidence, and your confidence will continue to improve. But we'd expect that initially you will have a longer landing distance required. So not being current on this manoeuvre could also affect the distance required. So if we put all of those factors together in what may seem a ridiculous scenario, really worst case scenario, have a read of that. And you can probably gather what would happen in this situation. We're not going to be able to stop in the landing distance available, and we're going to overrun and end up in the trees. It doesn't take all of these factors for this to happen. All it takes is one poor decision or a lack of awareness about even one of those factors for this kind of thing to happen. And again, the CAA statistics paint a very sobering picture of just how many landing and takeoff incidents are happening from runway excursions. I remember, probably it's going back about 10 years ago now, 2 aeroplanes from the same flight school overran the same runway in the space of a couple of months, I think it was. And they put a huge article about it in Vector. It was at TM's Aerodrome. It's a 1,200 metre runway, and they were in 172s, and both pilots overran the runway and ended up in sewage ponds at the end. They reckon the first pilot reported that the aeroplane floated for a lot longer than expected, even though his indicated speeds were correct. And they assessed that there was actually a bit of a sea breeze happening, so there was actually a tailwind component because this was right next to the sea, right? And so he failed to go around. The second one, touched down quite late as well, assessed that he wasn't going to be able to stop in time, tried to go around, but there was insufficient runway left for him to get airborne, went straight through the fence into the pond. Both had to swim to shore, covered in crap. Not good. So why did that happen? Difficult to say precisely, but maybe a lack of awareness of some of these factors we've just discussed, and clearly a lack of a decision to go around. If something doesn't look right, seem right, it isn't, so do something about it. Have another go or divert to a different aerodrome if required. Okay, human factors, airmanship. Initially you'll find I'll place a restriction on you, so you won't be able to practice short field takeoffs and landings solo on the grass. Once you are confident and competent, a little bit later on in your training here at Massey, then we'll look at that. But you and I on dual flights will continue to use the grass runway to give you that competence and confidence. Decision making is a huge part of this lesson. What we'll need to do is brief the approach. So we will select a KDP 5 altitude. This doesn't have to be the standard 300 feet AGL, isn't it? This doesn't have to be the standard 300 feet AGL that we use for normal circuits. It could be varied depending on the runway, the terrain that surrounds the aerodrome. For example, Taihape, if we were to actually land on the runway at Taihape, it's a one-way airstrip with a huge hill at the end of it. We wouldn't want to descend to 300 feet before making our go-around decision because we're going to go splat. We would probably have a higher KDP 5, maybe 500, 600, 700 feet or whatever. That can be altered to suit the situation. It can be a stressful exercise because you're very much thinking, right, I need to get this aeroplane on the ground at the start of the runway, otherwise I might run off the end of it because it is a short runway. The stress is alleviated with regular practice with me on board and practicing on longer runways where you do have the extra distance. Once you're comfortable and confident with that, then I'll allow you to practice this solo on the grass runway. We use a slightly lower threshold crossing speed for a short field landing, 65 knots. So we reduce the inertia and momentum of the aeroplane, and that'll help us to minimize the landing distance required. That speed changes depending on the aircraft you fly. So it may be specified in the aircraft's flight manual, so always check. It may be necessary, as we discussed in the short field takeoff briefing, for you to adjust that speed if you've got a lot of crosswind or if it's gusty. But again, don't just do that blindly. Think about the effect of that increased speed. More momentum, longer landing distance. Is it still safe to land? Because we can't quantify the extra distance required when we are adjusting those speeds. You'll find generally more power is usually required on the approach, higher drag, more power required to maintain the given speed. There's slightly more drag at 65 knots. We're also a little bit closer to the stall speed, so very active management is required of both the nose attitude and the power to maintain both your speed and your profile. So it's quite normal to need to regularly adjust the power and attitude on these kind of approaches. So if you think about when we did the short field takeoff calculation, we calculated that both for the ground run, but also 250 feet. And when we do a short field landing, when we calculate the landing distance, it is also from 50 feet above the threshold. So what do you think the effect of passing over the threshold at 50 feet would be on the landing distance required? Feel free to ask that question of them. And hopefully someone will say, oh, you need longer distance. So would it not be better for us to actually plan to land at the threshold so we can reduce the landing distance required and maximize the landing distance available? And you can get that figure from the P chart, which we'll have a look at the end of this briefing. Okay, so now the specifics of the air exercise. So prior to the flight, we've got to calculate our landing distance required, compare it to the landing distance available, make sure it's safe, make sure it works with our own personal minima as well, and make a decision based on that. When we're in the downwind phase of the aerodrome that we want to land at, we've got to reassess what the conditions actually are, because we may have done that calculation sometime earlier, and maybe the wind is different, maybe the temperature's changed, maybe the QNH has changed. All of that is reasonably likely, and all of that invalidates your calculation. So you have to determine whether or not the temperature's increased, or whether or not the temperature, the pressure, and the wind has increased or decreased. Maybe it's no longer safe to land on this runway. Maybe you have to do another calculation before landing, or maybe you have to divert it to another airplane. It's really important to think about the actual conditions. We're going to pick a decision altitude, so the KDP5 altitude, based on the terrain around us, and a touchdown point. Now that touchdown point generally should be as close to the threshold as possible, because we're wanting to maximize the landing distance available. The approach is normal really up until we turn on to final, and then once you're on final, get the aeroplane configured straight away. Do the landing checks, and we want to start slowing down to the threshold crossing speed. And it's helpful to have stabilized at that speed and with landing flap extended before we reach KDP5, because that is a decision altitude. If we're not configured or on speed, centerline profile at that altitude, we are going around. More power required on the approach, as I've discussed, and the subtle difference in the landing this time is that we don't close the throttle, as the aiming point rises to meet us, we will leave the power on until we've actually set the landing attitude. What can happen is, because the speed is a little bit slower than a normal approach speed, as you start to round out, the airspeed rapidly reduces, and that can cause a very high rate of descent. So we leave the power on until we minimize that rate of descent and set the landing attitude, and then we can touch down on the main wheels, lowering the nose wheel gently, and then start braking. Initially just softly, and then as we slow down more and more, you can increase that braking more and more and more. And it's also helpful at the same time to start increasing the back pressure on the stick. The students won't know the answer to why that is, but why do you do that? It's kind of weird, right? We touch down, we lower the nose, and then we start doing this again.
So it puts more weight on the main wheels, which is where we're braking, so it makes it more efficient to brake.
Yep, absolutely. Any other reasons? Yeah, potentially if the angle of attack is increasing. Yeah. What else?
Get more rolling resistance on the tyres.
Yep. Anything else? There's one more. What is it? I've forgotten it. I can't remember. Oh yeah. You think about it in a car, when you slam your brakes on, everything goes like this, downwards, right? The same thing happens in an aeroplane. The prop will get closer to the ground, so easing back will help to keep the prop clear. Remember, we could be landing on a grass runway, and later on for a precautionary landing, could be a rough surface. You don't want the prop to hit the ground. That's it. So nice simple one, okay, especially if you've just delivered the short field takeoff briefing. So really emphasize that decision making is important, awareness is important. And at this point you do a T-chart. You could use the same data as for the short field takeoff, or use Palmy, it doesn't matter, but run through that, because this is where you'll introduce the landing T-chart with the student. I'll just check I haven't missed anything there. I usually tell a story to my students about poor decision making in this exercise. A company I used to work for prior to when I started, there was another pilot, and they'd flown to Turangi on this day to pick up a group of passengers for a scenic flight. And I don't know if any of you have ever flown in there, but you got a runway like that, and there's a main road there, Euroclub over here, and then passengers can all sit here and watch people land. And he came in and landed on the southerly runway, and I can't remember whether there was a tailwind or he just floated, but anyway, he touched down really late, passengers there, he realised he wasn't going to stop, slammed on the brakes, and realised he was still going to go through the fence, and did a ground loop here. The aeroplane spun around on the spot right in front of the passengers that he was about to take on a scenic flight. I don't remember if they still went or not, but not a good look, eh? So why did that happen? I don't know the full story, but maybe there was a tailwind, maybe, or regardless though, there was a lack of a decision to go around. That could have been really serious, it could have killed 5 odd passengers there, and that would have shut the company down. So poor decision making, regardless of what the factors involved that contributed to it were. So if you know of any incidents like that, feel free to use them, because it adds interest. It tells the student, hey, this is something that actually happens and I really do have to think about it. Another thing I tell my students more about in the flight is they've got to be cautious not to slam on the brakes when you touch down. After I just started here, within probably the first 3 months, I went to fielding to do short field landings with the student, and they were a little bit too enthusiastic with the braking after we touched down, and one of the main tyres popped, and we lost control of the aeroplane and just about ended up in the side of the runway. Fortunately, we were landing on, 2-8, and you know how there's that taxiway there somewhere. You're about 300 metres here, and we couldn't control the aeroplane, and it would have gone off the runway, and the only thing that stopped that from happening is where we lost control was right there. So it just vacated onto the taxiway, but you know, that could have happened back here, and we could have hit the tyres on the side of the runway, or we would have ended up in the grass and the ditch or something. So you've got to be careful when you're teaching this that they don't slam on the brakes, because they do go pop, and then you do lose control. It's not controllable with a pops tyre. It's actually happened quite a few times. Not very few years now, I don't think, but we used to have pop tyres reasonably regularly. In fact, in the FIC room, you know, there's all those tyres underneath. One of those tyres was from the flight that I did with the student.
Little souvenir.
Yeah. Anyway, little stories like that can be interesting or serve a point, but just if you are talking about incidents and accidents, don't judge date, because we don't know the full circumstances behind things. You know, use it as a teaching opportunity. And, hey, this is what might have happened. This is what perhaps the pilot should have done, rather than lay blame. Does anyone have any questions on that? Okay. All right, 5-minute break, and then